Hello and welcome to 2025. This is just a quick little beginning of the year piece that I'm going to be doing about what we can maybe expect in the next 6 to 12 months and what we're going to be doing here at the On the Edge studio. But first, just briefly, I know everybody is reacting to the interview, 3-hour interview between President Zelenskyy and Lex Fridman, the podcaster who is a descendant of a Soviet citizen who moved to, I believe it was Glendale. Anyhow, he's a Russian American who apparently, according to President Zelenskyy, doesn't speak Russian very well. So he might have been a bit Americanized, not least of which is the fact that he clearly doesn't understand the nationalism, the fascism of Putin's Russia, or for that matter, the imperial mindset of many Russians, which has existed for centuries. And he certainly seems to have lost his sense of the Russkaya dusha, or the Russian soul. I won't go into great depth on this. I haven't watched the entire 3 hours because, frankly, I can't be arsed. I've gotten the snippets, and I am considering doing both an abbreviated and a full-length analysis of the interview, but we'll round out with that at the end. Because first and foremost, I want to talk about what I expect or what I anticipate in the coming 6 to 12 months. Firstly, on the war front, the Russians can't win. They don't have the capacity, and I will tell you why that is, in my opinion, although it is controversial because, of course, Russia is making minute advances in the Donbass. They might take the Donbass. That is true. But they can't win the war because ultimately two of the most important aims and objectives for Russia, and certainly Putin's Russia, is to change and control the government in Kiev, making it a client state, a puppet state, much like we see north of here in Belarus with Lukashenko. That's not going to happen. That's simply not going to happen. Even if he was able to roll tanks down the center of this city, there would be a partisan war. There would be resistance to any kind of puppet president or prime minister or however he shakes up the government. The leadership, if it is sympathetic to Moscow, will never be accepted by the people of Ukraine. And secondly, if he does not take Odessa, which, again, I have been to in the place is a fortress, he cannot control the Black Sea. He will be forced to find alternative places than Sevastopol to base his Black Sea fleet, which is practically non-functioning, bottled in their harbor because of the threat of Ukrainian strikes on their certainly their surface fleet. So if you can't make Crimea a center for one of your 4 major fleets, then why fight so hard for a land bridge to support it? Because Crimea and Sevastopol cannot be supported simply by the Kerch Strait Bridge, not least of which because it's falling into the sea. Now, negotiations. They're not going to go as well as I think incoming President Donald Trump thinks they're going to go for a variety of reasons, not least of which because Ukraine is not just going to walk away from this and, say, let bygones be bygones. And they're certainly not just going to let Moscow take control of some of the oblasts that they say, conducted a referendum, in quotes, and among those, maybe they would be willing to let go of Donetsk and Luhansk, seen as they've been occupied for over a decade. But the concept of Kherson or Zaporizhia will be unacceptable to most Ukrainians. Now, when it comes down to Mariupol in particular and then Crimea as a whole, This is a far more sticky wicket. There are lots of displaced people from those locations, and they are going to want to be able to go home, particularly the Crimean Tatars, whose history stretches back centuries, and many who have homes there that have been in their family's possession for centuries. So what do you do with them? I don't have an answer, but they're not going to go home to a Crimea that is occupied by Russia. And from the Russian perspective, for Vladimir Putin to cede those territories, Crimea in particular again, but also Mariupol, would be a devastating loss. And, when it comes to these negotiations, another problem that we are going to see this year is that in many ways, Vladimir Putin can't stop the war the way it is right now. He can't stick it in amber or stop it altogether because he finds himself with hundreds of thousands of men who are mobilized, and a country that has lost hundreds of thousands of men and will be grieving and asking what was it all for. But in realistic terms, also, what do you do with those men as they come back from the front lines? His economy is highly transitioned to a war economy. So these hundreds of thousands will be returning to homes and places where factories are no longer or are transitioning back from producing tanks and shells and all of that. Those men are going to be lacking in jobs. So what do you do as you transition back to a peacetime economy? What do you do with all these men? What do you do with the cost of transitioning these things back and still probably most likely being under at least some sanctions, although maybe some sanctions will be lifted as part of the negotiations. But this is a repeating problem in Russian history, not least of look at the Decembrists, for goodness sake. When troops came back from the Napoleonic War, they had an uprising, and that's the start of the 19th century. And then, of course, you fast forward to the troops coming home from the devastating losses on the Eastern Front in World War I that were a major reason why the Romanov dynasty was ripped down and out of the Winter Palace. So Putin knows this, of course. Putin knows his own country's history more so than anybody, I should say. And what happens when Russians lose wars and those troops come home in defeat? It ends with whoever is sat in the Kremlin most likely losing their head, figuratively or literally. So he's caught in a catch-22. He can't stop the war, but he also can't continue with the bleeding and the devastation of his economy. Don't let anybody tell you that the Russian economy is doing just fine. It's not. It is stretched to damn near breaking point, especially if the Europeans follow through with this idea of shutting down their shadow fleet so that they can't evade the sanctions. But not just that. Gazprom, which isn't just a company, it's a pillar of the economy, is operating in the deep red. That's pretty much unheard of. The ruble is, collapsing. Look, I am not an economist, but here on the edge, we have spoken to people who know about this far better than I do. That's the reason why I do this. And his economy is in serious trouble. All of these factors together are going to be a push-pull on him when it comes to any kind of negotiations. And do the wheels grind to a halt in 2025, forcing him to the table? How quickly can he get a resolution? Can he sell it to the Russian people as a victory? It's going to be a hard sell, considering probably by the time any kind of negotiations are ended, we'll have crossed the 1 million casualty mark for the Russians in this war. Folks are going to want answers when it's all said and done. They may be fighting a jingoistic, patriotic, we will stand our ground, we're good Russians, and we will suffer through it no matter what. That's all well and good. But when the war ends and they look back in retrospect, what are they going to say? And who are they going to turn their ire on? The Tsar can only hide behind blaming others for so long. Look at Russian history. So that's an incredibly difficult situation for him. But, in many ways, I'm hoping that the Russian defeat, which I still firmly, as I have said, will end in defeat, might give them a moment to finally, something they should have done in 91 at the collapse of the Soviet Union, but they kicked the can down the road, is look hard in the mirror. And they're going to come for Putin, because it was funny during that Lex Fridman interview with the president here in Kiev. He said, "You don't think that Putin loves his country?" And Zelenskyy said, "No," and he's right. Putin doesn't love his country. He may believe in the grandness of his country. He may believe in the power and the position where he wants to drive Russia to be on the global stage. But he doesn't love his people. A man like that, who aspires to the kind of power that he aspires to and will do anything to get it. I was in the 90s. I saw him kill his own people in apartment buildings to get into the Kremlin. So don't tell me that he loves his people. Another example of when Fridman was completely out of his depth. Now, bigger picture. Watch Georgia. Obviously, we see what's happening currently on the streets, but as we've discussed on this channel before, there is always the threat of some sort of violence, much like we saw on Maidan, with an overstep of the government using violence, and then things get chaotic, and then there are breakaway republic and separatists and people who are pro-Moscow calling for the Russians to come in and save them. Now, many have said that the Russians are already too widely stretched. That perhaps is one reason why they lost Syria last year. But I think there's a chance that the tanks might roll in Georgia, not least of which because of this seagoing issue. If they cannot have Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet is currently kind of posted at a port on the eastern shore of the Black Sea in Russian Federation territory. But potentially another alternative for them is a deep sea port in Georgia, the Aklya, if I'm recalling it correctly, port that is currently in construction but could be sped up and could be an alternative. But they will not have dominion of the Black Sea, and they certainly won't have it from Sevastopol, and that's going to be a major blow for Vladimir Putin. So keep your eye on Georgia. It's also just important because Georgia deserves to be free, much like Ukraine deserves to be free. The concept that Moscow has of strategic depth and sacrificing millions of its neighbors to its despotic whims is not acceptable, should not be acceptable to the world. Invading your neighbors because you feel unsafe, well, too bad for you. Strengthen your own domestic situation. Another near abroad for Moscow that we should keep an eye on is Belarus. We'll try and get somebody on the show to discuss this. They have an election. I again say in quotation marks, coming up in March and the last time that they had a quote-unquote election, and Lukashenko, surprise, surprise, won, it was one of the biggest mass street protests that we've seen in Belarus. And given the change in Moscow's power, I would not be terribly surprised if we see another Belarusian uprising, or only rightfully so. supported hopefully more wholeheartedly by Europe and the general West, but certainly something that Kiev would love to see happen as well. It would strengthen their hand. And heck, a lot of Belarusians are here fighting in Ukraine for just that reason. Now, when we talk about the Europeans, they have to step it up. And they're doing so. I think the breaking of the cable between the communications cable between Finland and Estonia recently, and the fact that a lot of Nordic and Baltic states are saying they're going to start doing spot checks of vessels leaving Russian waters because there is this entire shadow fleet which continues to trade in natural gas or other fossil fuels, and that is funding their war here in violation of sanctions. So if they start doing that in earnest, that's going to cut off a more money. But the sanctions need to be strengthened, and Europe needs to be a major player in the crackdown on those sanctions. They also have to step up production, and in many ways, I think they're going to do it. But one other thing that I have heard spoken of in certain corridors in Europe is the idea of a European strategic alliance that would be separate from NATO. And I'm of two minds about that, and we'll see how this goes in the coming year or even years potentially. I have two minds about it because, of course, Putin would love that. That's exactly what he would like, is division between NATO and EU. I'm not opposed to a EU alliance, military alliance, but I think it should be under the umbrella of NATO, or at least in partnership with NATO. So we'll keep an eye on that as well. European, both diplomatic, political, and of course military. I guess three things there in the transatlantic alliance. When it comes to those negotiations, before I start to wind down here, I am of the mind, and I know that when I say this, people say I'm putting on a tinfoil hat, and then I'm seeing Russian manipulation behind every tree. They've been very good about being dismissive about Russian interference in our body politic, in our culture, in our media, whether it's Elon Musk and his X platform and Musk's ties to the Kremlin, or ultimately the fact that I still do believe wholeheartedly that Trump is compromised by Putin in one way, shape, or form. If he wasn't complicit in 2016, if he was a useful idiot at that time, those days are long gone. And I'm sure with all the secretive meetings that he's had sitting down with Putin, that the Russian president has relayed to Donald Trump that he is vulnerable to attack because the Russians put him in office in 2016 in no small measure. So, finally, 2025 for On the Edge. I know you can get your war information from a lot of different sources. And I'm not what I call a scrimmage line man. I'm not going to tell you who's taken this village or this kilometer here or that kilometer there. I'll keep an eye on the big picture of it as well, of course. But as I said at the very beginning, the grand objectives of the Russian military and Moscow's intention is beyond its grasp. It cannot change the government in Kiev, and it cannot take dominion of the Black Sea because of Odessa, and it can't take Odessa. So there's the war cannot be won by Russia ultimately, with its primary strategic aims in mind. Now there are lots of other things that are going on here, but that's the one thing that I am convinced of. We'll see how it goes. War is fickle, but there's not going to be some sort of massive Ukrainian rout, and suddenly you've got Russian tanks on the Black Sea coast, Odessa, down along the Corniche there. That ain't going to happen, and the tanks aren't going to roll in Kiev. So I'm not going to be doing that. My purpose is here, in my mind, is to talk in depth to people who have unique perspective into this war and a special voice to give, but primarily to give voice to those who have skin in the game, Ukrainians and those people who live in the neighborhood, those who are on the edge. Um, and I do that because Moscow's information warfare is extremely skilled, and it ain't going to stop anytime soon. Uh, I I have seen it manipulate so much of the narrative about what is going on this war because, of course, the press corps, as I have repeatedly been hypercritical about, is not here, and they have let down um, the side basically in their efforts to relay what is really going on here and what is at stake and who are these people that are being attacked by the Kremlin, and indeed to make it relevant to our populations in the West, that they are also under attack, but that attack is happening in their information space and in their minds. They are manipulating the perception of reality of what is going on here. And because the press corps is doing such a piss poor job of covering this war and the situation here, it goes unchallenged. Well, that is what On the Edge intends to push back against. That is our intent. But I'm not doing day-to-day stuff or, as I say, the scrimmage line, with a possible exception, and I'll come back to that. But it is going to be difficult for us to do that because they are so adept. So we are determined to try and counter Moscow's narrative. If we can keep our resolve, if our populations are not manipulated by the GRU or the aquarium or the Internet Research Agency, I am convinced that the West can win this war. It is within our grasp, 100%. But only if we keep our resolve and, in fact, bolster that resolve. And I don't know if Donald Trump, as now the leader of the Western world, is going to do that. It might fall to others. So, in general, I'm hoping that we can expand our audience, and I'm going to be taking a couple of measures to do that. First and foremost, we're going to be setting up a Patreon. Now, I'd start this Patreon for a variety of reasons, but it would not be for financial gain. This studio is going to remain open. I have the means to fund it, and I'll be damned if I'm not going to do that, even if I take a pretty strong financial hit myself. It's that important, but it would be nice not to be hemorrhaging cash, to have a little bit of support, to pay the rent, to pay my wonderful colleagues and staff that I have working here, from our producing staff to our cameramen, editors, and logistical support. I'd love to be able to pay them and maybe expand to have somebody who's in charge of or helping with social media, that kind of stuff. And then I also think another reason for opening a Patreon this year is to create community. Those of you who deeply care about Ukraine and find benefit with the stuff that I put out, I think having a community on Patreon would strengthen that and bolster it. So that's my intent and the reason why I'm thinking, not just thinking, I'm going to do a Patreon channel that you folks can subscribe to and help us here to keep things going in the coming year. We will be stepping up our game there. If you guys want like a weekly analysis, again, going against kind of my general, I'm not going to take news of the day, but I could do a weekly show and put it on Patreon if that is something you are interested in. Please, I'm open to your suggestions below. My other alternative was to, at some point, either during that weekly kind of news rundown, to have a Q&A with some sort of streaming capacity. This is old dogs and new tricks, folks. I am in uncharted territory for me, but I'm still going to keep doing this. In the meantime, do please like and share the body of our work that we've done already. We are fast approaching our 30th episode, so that's nice. But if more folks watch, more folks might understand the complexities of what's happening here. It's we can win this war. Ukraine will win this war because of the factors that I laid out there. So I don't know what 2025 is going to exactly look like. It's most likely going to be quite painful. There's going to be fits and starts. What happens on the diplomatic stage will be obviously very significant because that's where Moscow hopes to win its victory by dissuading us or making or forcing Ukraine to a compromise that only facilitates a war down the road, or as Lex Fridman and Zelenskyy, when they had their conversation, there has to be justice. And so there have to be terms for a just peace, not just a capitulation on the side of Kiev. Now, one of the things that I might first do, if you're truly interested, folks, is put a 3-hour, which would be like pulling teeth, I think, but I'll do it, analysis of that interview and put that on the Patreon maybe next Wednesday. If there's a desire, I think I'm going to do a briefer version of it to touch on certain things. But again, as I close out here, and welcome to 2025, all of you. Thank you so much for being with us if you've been with us heretofore. Look, that interview was a hack job. This is why we need professional journalists to be doing this. You don't just parachute into taking such a comprehensive and extensive interview with a world leader with the complexities of this conflict. I have the same criticism of Tucker Carlson with his interview of Putin. He was clearly out of his depth, and I think with Zelenskyy, Fridman is so removed from the realities of what Putin's Russia and the Russian Empire really have in their deep character and intent, shows that you can't just half-ass this. And so, again, another criticism of the International Press Corps. We'll do our best. We're not going anywhere. On the Edge, we'll continue to work as best we can from this studio here in Kiev, bringing you unique voices with unique perspectives, and also, most importantly, voices from on the ground here. As we move into 2025, that is our intent. So as I say, going into this new year, Slava Ukraini и Героям Slava.